A very good morning to each and everyone present here. I, Sonal Tirki, welcome you all to yet another lecture, an addition to our ongoing lecture series for the preparation of the UGC NET JRF exam. I feel immense gratitude to welcome the resource person for today's lecture, Ms. Kriti Acharya ma'am. She's a known face as she has been a part of our online lecture series, and also that she is an alumna of our institute. She is a research scholar in I.E.H.E Kharagpur and got her JRF in 2021. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation, and we will look forward to today's lecture. Without any further delay, we will start with today's lecture, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Sonal, for the introduction. So, good morning, everyone. Today we will be discussing post-colonialism. As you can see, I have named the very first slide as Introduction to Post-Colonialism. And there is a reason why, because post-colonialism or post-colonial theory is a bundle of approaches, right? So we are not referring to any one particular theorist or the concepts that they have given or discovered, but we are looking at post-colonialism as an approach of how we in the post-colonial era approach any form of text. And when I say text, I mean not just literary text, but art, culture, and various other forms that have been influenced by the colonial rule. Okay, moving further, let's understand post-colonialism theory first, and let's try to define it. So, post-colonialism theory critically examines the political, cultural, aesthetic, economic, linguistic, historical, and social impacts of colonial rule, generally European colonial rule. Okay, so as you can see, so we are not looking at any one particular aspect. So we will be examining politically and how the culture of the colonies got influenced, not just the colonies, but as we move further, we'll discuss hybridity, ambivalence, that it's not just the culture of the colonies that got changed over the period of time. There was certain kind of negotiation which happened between the colonizers and the colonized. Okay, so the elements from different cultures merged together and gave rise to multiculturalism. We will be discussing all these things. So, but I just wanted to clarify that we are not only talking about literary texts. When we approach any text from post-colonial theory, it can be a painting also, right? We can interpret a painting from a post-colonial perspective. And how we'll do that, we'll come to it in a while. And also linguistics, and when we talk about language is a very important aspect of colonialism, because as we will see in the presentation after a few minutes, that how blackness or the Orient or Occident identities were constructed, and there was a binary opposition in that was formed in the understanding of the colonized and the colonizers, how the colonized identity was formed, and linguistics and language played a very important role. Why we value one particular language over all the indigenous languages or indigenous forms of knowledge also, right? So why we need to prioritize one over the other, all these things we'll understand from post-colonialism perspective. And the second definition is the simpler one. Post-colonial theory is first and foremost a body of writing that attempts to 1 minute. Okay, so it attempts to see the dominant ways of thinking about the relations between the Westerners and the non-Westerners, right? Why the Western perspective is always considered to be central in any discourse, and why the perspective from non-Western civilizations are pushed to the margins. All these things we understand through post-colonial theory. Okay, so as I mentioned before, today we will be discussing some of the foremost critics and their works, and what are the important points that are raised in their works, and what are the important concepts that they gave us to analyze text in the post-colonial light. I hope I'm audible and all of you are with me on this.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So when we talk about Frantz Fanon, he was a psychologist. So this is the thing we need to understand. So when he looks at the relationship between a colonizer and the colonized, he looks at this relationship from the perspective of a psychologist. Okay, but at the same time, he is also a Marxist. When we talk about Marxism, what Marxists do, they look at the history of the world as a history of class conflict. Take any example, for example, French Revolution, right? So the bourgeois, the ruling class was so disconnected and unaware of the plight of the masses, the peasants, the working class people, that they kept on exploiting them. They were not even aware of their miseries and they were not concerned even. So what happened, there was a gap. And so, from the Marxist perspective, if we see, there is always a conflict between these two classes. One class which controls the means of production, and the other class which labors, provide cheap labor and works for the bourgeois class, right? So, Frantz Fanon was also a Marxist. So, he said, if we see at the construction of blackness or how subalterns and the minorities are constructed psychologically, we see the base is of the economic oppression. It begins with economic oppression. For example, India, during the British rule, the British used to control all the means of production, right? But the wealth was not evenly distributed. So the Indians started feeling that first there was economic oppression. Okay. And then they started inheriting this thought process that they are inferior. They are inherently inferior. So then it becomes psychological oppression as well. But it started with Marxism. So whenever we talk about Frantz Fanon and his first work, Black Skin, White Mask, we need to keep this in mind that he was a Marxist. So he looked at the relationship between the colonizers and colonized from Marxist perspective, that who is controlling the means of production and wealth is being distributed unequally, right? Two things. And this is leading to psychological trauma in the minds of the colonized, because they are perceiving themselves as inferiors, and this starts from child. Okay, so this was the central idea of Black Skin, White Mask. Moving on. Okay, the second work was The Wretched of the Earth. One more thing that all of you must note is that both these works are translated. Okay, he wrote in French. He did not write in English. So the titles are also translated. So the central idea, there are several things that he discusses, but one of the most important things which he discusses in this work is the pitfalls of national consciousness. Okay, what Frantz Fanon says is that once a country becomes officially decolonized, okay, so the colonizers have moved back. Now the power resides in the hands of the nationalists. But what happens, the people who take over the country, or the nationalists or the political parties who have the power after decolonization, they are not well trained, or they don't have what it takes to rule in a fair manner, right? Because whatever they have learned from the colonizers. So they don't have the knowledge of how to rule the new nations. Like he says, the masses of a colonized country and colonized nationalist political parties are. What has happened? Yes. So he says that they are usually not on the same page. So the working class people of the newly independent nation and the people who are controlling that nation, they are also from the same nation, but there is a class difference. Again, we see Marxist perspectives. So there is a ruling class, then there is a peasant class or the working class, and their way of perceiving things is poles apart. Okay, so such political parties, newly formed political parties of the colonized intellectuals. So all these intellectuals now, they are ruling the new country, but they are the urban proletariat, right? They present less than 1% of the actual population. They are not part of the working class that is actually struggling, but they have a fairly privileged life. They are not connected to the roots. They do not know what is the ground reality. And these people drive most of their identity from the colonial lifestyle. So there is a divide, and because of this divide, this leads to new forms of colonization. The new country is not truly independent. Okay, so again, there is a difference. There are two poles which we see. And one more thing that he says, that culture is created through the developing nation's consciousness of a struggling and new independent nation. So basically, he differentiates between two things. One is a country and second is the nation. He says country is a geographical concept, okay, but nation is a psychological concept. When a nation as a whole struggles for liberty, struggles for freedom, then national consciousness rises. That makes a geographical piece of land a nation. Okay, so he differentiates between these two things. Moving on, now we will discuss Edward Said. He is one of the exemplary and the foremost critics when it comes to post-colonialism, and you must be aware about his works. So his most important work is Orientalism, okay, published in 1978, and he examines Western representations, fiction and non-fiction. Okay, so again, whenever we are referring to text, we are not referring to literary text only. Okay, not only fictional text, but also non-fictional, which also includes history. So if you will see these days, there is a trend. It shouldn't be called a trend, but if you see, people are trying to rewrite history from below. What we are able to understand right now is that whenever history used to be written, there used to be certain privileges. Also, who gets to write history, for whom, and how? All these questions are very, very important. Uh, for example, suppose there is a king. Okay, he is a patron of a historicist, and that person is writing history. Wouldn't he be biased towards the king? Wouldn't he glorify his achievements, exaggerate how benevolent he was, how smart he was, how important his reforms were there for public? This is just one example. Another example, if you look at the revolt of 1857, there are again two perspectives. From the perspective of the colonizers, from the British perspective, it was Sepoy mutiny. Okay, because the Sepoys revolted and they revolted against the crown, which was unforgiving. But if we see from Indian perspective, people say it was first war of independence. That people realize that they need to break free from the shackles of colonial rule. So two very, very different perspectives, right? So how history is written, history, we will also discuss how knowledge is not innocent. Whatever we see, we listen, we hear, on the basis of that we form our opinions. So it is also, whatever we think is also tainted by whatever we have heard, whatever this discourse has told us about any particular thing, right? So that's what Said also says. He says that we need to examine the Western representations of the Middle Eastern societies. He, in particular, examines Middle Eastern societies, but we can use these concepts to understand what is going on in any post-colonial society. So what he does is that he applies a revised form of Foucault's historicist critique of discourse to analyze cultural imperialism. Now let's understand what this means. So there are two important terms, discourse and cultural imperialism. So the term discourse was defined by who? Michel Foucault. Please keep that in mind. Okay, this is not science term. Michel Foucault, he defined discourse. And what is discourse? It is a system of thought that governs the knowledge obtained by a person. Right? What we just discussed. If I have certain opinions about any particular topic, XYZ, so those opinions are not entirely my own. I formed those opinions on the basis of the knowledge I received, on the basis of the information that I received, right? But I receive information from several sources. All these sources may or may not be biased, but more than often all these sources are biased because they receive this information from somewhere else. So the concept of discourse questions the entire idea of truth with the capital T. There are so many interpretations, there are so many ways of perceiving things, and also whatever knowledge we are gathering, we are getting it from preconceived notions and ideas. Okay, do you remember the concept of Althusser when he talks about interpolation? So everything we think is our own opinion is actually tainted by all the opinions or the text or the interpretations that we have come across. Okay, so that's what forms discourse. Everything that has been said, discussed, written, read about any particular topic comprises of the discourse. Then let's talk about cultural imperialism. What is cultural imperialism? A mode of imperialism that exerts its power not by force, but by the effective means of disseminating in subjugated colonies a Eurocentric discourse. Now, what is Eurocentric discourse? Whenever we talk about post-colonialism, we see that often while analyzing the text written during colonial period as well, we are seeing things from the Eurocentric perspective. What is Eurocentric perspective? Keeping Europe at the center of the discourse. Okay, seeing everything from the perspective of Europe. Even if you look at the map, our world, it's what is the shape of the globe? It's circular, it's round, right? The earth is geoid in shape. But when we look at the map, Europe is at the center, right? But why are we perceiving everything from the perspective of Europe and marginalizing all other perspectives, right? All the other perspectives are being pushed to the periphery. And this leads to the creation of a binary of the Occident and the Orient. Okay, what is Occident? Occident are the Europeans, the academicians, or the journalists, fiction writers, scholars who create knowledge about the Orient. Orient becomes the exotic inferior. So the Orients are the people from the colonies, right? The people who have been colonized, they become exotic, they become inferior. So we start perceiving the colonizers and the colonized against in terms of binary, the structuralist binary, right? The self and the other. So Europe is always the self, and the colonies and the people living in these colonies, they become the other. So they are perceived as inferior, right? So whenever we see this binary, still people have a lot of inherent bias about the color of the skin, right? So why we need to perceive black skin or black color as inferior? Why we associate with white with purity? Right? There is no natural relation between these things. These are all cultural construct. We have started associating whiteness with purity. There is no natural relationship, right? So as we see in structuralism also, the words and the meanings, there is no so the relation basically is arbitrary. There is no natural connection between the two. This is what he talks about. So again, let's go to the point, the second point, applied a revised form of Foucault's historicist critique of discourse to analyze cultural imperialism. So how discourse, that is how knowledge works, and how it establishes the colonizer's perspective, and everything that is colonized, everything that is white, and how it places it on a pedestal, right? How it creates this binary through which we look down upon the exotic or the inferior. Actually, they consider the Orient, the exotic, and the inferior. It is not like that. Okay, these are not any stable categories, but this is how the colonizers perceive uh, people in their colonies, and they create knowledge in such a way that it is inherited or absorbed by the people living in the colonies. And every just like I discussed, that it creates a binary. So the same thing he's talking about, every culture needs a competitive other. So look at any religion, look at any community. There is always a competitive other to make yourself different from that competitive other, right? So the other is there to signify a lack which your community has. There is always this binary going on in the society. We need somebody else to define our identity, right? But these binaries are violent, these are power hierarchies. So whenever we are comparing ourselves, one is being put on the pedestal, the other is being considered inferior. This is what is being discussed here. And he used two terms, Orient and the Occident. So the Occident is the West, the Eurocentric discourse, and the Middle East in this work is the Orient, but the Orient term can also be applied to other colonies. I hope it's clear. If it's not, you can stop me at any point of time and ask again. Okay? All right. So now we are moving on to another important term given by Edward Said. It is called contrapuntal reading. What is contrapuntal reading? It is reading against the grain. This phrase was used by Terry Eagleton. So what happens is, in contrapuntal reading, we analyze a text as inherently shaped by the prejudices, myths, and ideologies of the culture in which it was produced. Just as we discussed, knowledge is not innocent, right? So the discourse is also not innocent. Whatever we are coming across, or whatever opinion we are forming, whatever knowledge we are gaining, it is not innocent. It is always tainted by the prejudices, myths, and ideologies. So if a person's worldview is tainted by all these things, obviously whatever he writes will also carry these prejudices. So in contrapuntal reading, what we do is we try to analyze a text in the light of these things. We do not take the text as at its face value. Basically, we don't accept it as it is. And for example, Syed also applies contrapuntal reading to Mansfield Park. What happens in the Mansfield Park? It is a novel by Jane Austen, but they refer to a plantation in Antigua. So a lot of details are not there. They just briefly mention it, and there's a passing reference, and it in a way essentializes or normalizes drain of wealth from the colonies. It's a sugar plantation. So the luxurious life at Mansfield Park is being funded by a sugar plantation in Antigua. And it is normalized that it is okay. So there is also a reference to India in this novel when Mrs. Bertram says that I can get a shawl from India, I can get 2 shawls from India. So colonies are only being seen as a source of wealth for the colonizer. There's no humanistic approach. There's no human to human connection. They are not even considering them human. So in the case of Antigua, the plantation in Antigua, they somehow also justify slave trade, that this is the destiny of the slaves, right? So again, the binary is there. The slaves are there to uh, work for the colonizers, right? So in contrapuntal reading, we are trying to see things not as they are being told to us, but against the grain. That what must be the motivation, and what led to the formation of these prejudices? What are the ideologies that are being subtly, covertly, overtly, however they are being propagated through text? Okay. So, from net perspective, you should keep this in mind. Contrapuntal reading was introduced by Edward Said. Okay, and he applies the contrapuntal reading to Mansfield Park. These are the two facts that you must remember. Okay, and these are the two epigraphs in case they ask from where the epigraphs were taken. The text begins with two epigraphs. First is, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Okay, this was the statement given by Karl Marx. So, Said takes this statement and begins his work, Orientalism, with this statement. There is another epigraph as well, and the East is a career. What is the meaning of this? The East is a career. Anybody? Anyone who can explain this to me? It can be interpreted in a lot of ways.
Ma'am, maybe it refers to the like the colonial officials who come here, or maybe that if you go to the east, you can sort of exploit it, so you can earn money through it.
Yes. So this can be one way of looking at it. As we discussed earlier also, this post-colonial theory is a bundle of approaches, right? So East is a career. East can be a career for Westerners in so many ways, right? There can be economic interest. There can also be academic interest. Just now we discussed how the construction of blackness, or how the construction of Orient identity is carried out by Western scholars, okay, Western journalists. And so all these forces are at play. So they make a career out of it. And they are, even if they are trying to speak from the perspective of the colonized, they are still seeing things from a Eurocentric perspective, right? So East is a career for them. They do not understand the ground reality. And we can, as we move on with our presentation, we'll see the like in feminism, you talk about intersectionality, right? And also, if we see these things in the light of post structuralism, there cannot be two binaries. There is so much more to it. So it is creating just two categories is very, very problematic. So East is seen as a career for people, right? And people from the West are also trying to speak on behalf of the colonized, but they are not letting the colonized speak for themselves. So there's a need to make space for them, for letting them speak for themselves, right? If I present a story, or let's not call it a story, if I present an experience of a girl from a tribal area, okay, from a very underprivileged family, the way I present her experience will be very different from the way she presents her experience, right? I have not been in her shoes. So it's important for me to listen to her, to let her speak, and she can only speak in her language. So if I am actually trying to do something good, I need to learn her language and let her speak in her language, rather than forcing her to speak in my language, right? So all this politics is there. We'll also come to that. But again, please keep in mind these two things, the two epigraphs. So one is by Benjamin Disraeli, the East is a career, and the other one is, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented, by Karl Marx. K. Bhabha. He is also one of the foremost theorists when it comes to post-colonial theory. And we will be very briefly discussing the terms he gave and what are the concepts. First of all, let's see, we cannot discuss these terms in isolation with each other. So while explaining one term, I will be referring to another, and we'll understand all these terms together. So what is ambivalence? The idea of ambivalence sees culture as consisting of opposing perceptions and dimensions. Okay. Bhabha claims that ambivalence, this duality that presents a split in identity of the colonized other, allows for being who are a hybrid of their own cultural identity. Think about this thing. So the Britishers came to India, okay, and the Indians didn't know their language, but slowly they rose to power, and the entire country was under their control. So there were several things Indians had to do the British way, but there were also several things that the British had to do in an Indian way, and the amalgamation of these two cultures, when these two cultures are coming together, they gave rise to a new identity. So when we talk about hybridity also in terms of horticulture, so two breeds coming together, and whatever is produced, the result is the amalgamation of the characteristics of both the breeds, right? So similarly in hybridity, when one colony which had no contact with the other culture is coming in the contact with the other culture and has to transform itself. So there is hybridity, the final result, which comes from the merger of both the cultures, but there's also ambivalence. These people do not belong to any one pole now. Right, they are a mix of something, so their identity also becomes ambivalent. Okay, so the colonizers and the colonized both do a certain transaction of cultural change, and which gives rise to identities which are multicultural. Okay, so there is also this sort of ambivalence. There's no stability. It is fluid. The identity becomes fluid. It is hybrid, but of course fluid. And as I also discussed, hybridity. So the best examples we can take is Pidgin and Creole. Okay, and for example, think about any space where trade is happening. Let's forget about the politics for some time. Okay, so there's one commodity this one culture is trying to sell, there's another commodity that another culture is trying to sell, but to carry out this transaction they need to communicate, right? That's how Pidgin and Creole take form. First there will be Pidgin, and then how they are communicating with each other, new language will arise. Okay, that will be Creole. So we see some new identity formation is taking place, and also new language is coming into reality, right? It did not exist before, so this new language will have elements from both the cultures. Okay, it's a mix of both the cultures, but it's not balanced mixed, right? It will have its own new identity. And we can also talk about the concept of polyphony in this case. What is polyphony? I'm pretty sure you all must be familiar with Bhaktin, the idea of carnivalesque and all these things. So when we talk about polyphony, polyphony means multiplicity of voices. Okay, so people, when they have different cultural background, when people have different languages, when people have different worldviews, different indigenous knowledges, they perceive world from different perspectives, right? There will be no homogenized perspective, no universal perspective, and there will be polyphony of voices. So there will be multiplicity of voices. That's what Bhabha talks about in when he talks about hybridity and ambivalence. Okay. In case there is any confusion, you can stop me and ask any question that you like. Now, talking about mimicry, we have also discussed that when colonizers come to a new country or a new island, wherever they're going, they try to change the culture there. Okay, so they try to force their culture on the colonies. And what happens is when the colonized people are trying to learn the culture of the colonizers, there is also a possibility of mockery. Okay, mimicry is not always the same. Okay, as we go by the definition also, mimicry is the process by which colonized subject is reproduced as almost the same but not quite. So they are not exactly the same because they are copying, right? they have been born and brought up in a different culture. There's a lot of cultural heritage, a lot of traditions, a lot of indigenous forms of knowledge associated with their cultures. So they cannot forget all those things, but they're still trying to copy the colonizers and their culture. So a mimicry takes place. But what is the catch? The copying of the colonizing culture, behavior, or manners contains both mockery and a menace. What happens whenever you're trying to copy something? There is also a possibility that you will mock the person or the thing that you're copying in the process of mimicking it, right? So it can also be subversive in nature, it can be transgressive in nature. So it can produce a split in your personality, which also gives you a space to resist by complying. So it simultaneously you're complying and also defying. Are you able to understand?
Yes,
Hello?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
All right. Okay, so whenever we are trying to copy someone, there's always a possibility that while mimicking, we will not produce those representations exactly. There will be a blurred copy. And this blurred copy can be subversive in several ways, right? It can be mocking what we are trying to mimic. Okay, this was the concept of mimicry by Bhabha. Now there's also a concept of third space. What is third space, or interchangeably known as in between space? Okay, so Bhabha says the third space is a post colonial social linguistic theory of identity and community realized through language. See, there is a lot of stress that we are putting on language here, and we must understand we are referring to post structuralist discourse in this manner. How? Post structuralism says that uh, our world, or everything as we see, perceive, all the meaning that is created, the entire world is created linguistically, right? There's nothing outside language, there's nothing outside text. So our world is linguistically constructed because we use language for communication, we use language to perceive anything, we use language to understand anything, we need language to make meaning of everything, right? So that is why language is very, very central to our identity. Okay, the identity of our community, our individual identity. So language is a very important factor. And when Bhabha talks about third space, he is talking about that interstitial space, or where the cultures encounter. Okay, so in the beginning also I mentioned that uh, these two binaries are not sufficient to understand the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, because it's not only the colonized culture that is being influenced or that is undergoing a transformation when it comes into contact with the colonized culture, right? Both the cultures are negotiating in some way and a new culture is being produced. So where this is happening, that place is known as the third space. Okay, where the cultures negotiate. There's a transformation that cultures go through when they interact with each other. Okay, this type of culture subverts the colonial domination by deconstructing essentialist identity and binary opposition. So, when both the cultures are interacting with each other, they are being influenced with each other, the binary is dismantling, right? There's no pure, final, or watertight compartment in which you can put Eastern culture and Western culture, because both are interacting. Okay, moving on. Now we'll talk about Spivak, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, and we will be talking about this essay called Can the Subaltern Speak? And speculation on widow sacrifices. And I have written the whole title so that you remember that this is the subtitle, okay? Speculations on widow sacrifice, and it was published in 1988. Okay, so what Spivak discusses in this particular essay, she uses deconstructionism to examine how truth is constructed. So all this while we have been discussing that is it's very difficult to say that if there is any truth with a capital T. There are multiple perspectives, multiple interpretations, and there are no watertight compartment. Okay. So she also introduces the concept of gender and sexual difference. What she says between this colonizers and colonized binary. Okay, we are essentializing both these categories as if they are homogeneous categories, as if they are uniform categories, that all the colonizers are the same and all the colonized are the same, right? So this is questionable. So she problematizes these categories and introduces the concept of gender, not the concept, the question of gender and sexual difference in the world. Okay, so she's also critical of the Western intellectuals. And I think once this was asked in NET that who are these two Western intellectuals who were criticized by Spivak in this essay? So you need to remember they are Foucault and Deleuze, Michel Foucault and Deleuze. Okay, for the same thing, I just gave you an example of sharing the experience of a tribal girl coming from an underprivileged background, living in difficult conditions. If she is given the space to speak for herself, she is the best person to speak for herself, right? We sitting in AC chambers, if we are trying to speak for them, we are again marginalizing their voices in some way, right? So the very title of this essay, can the subaltern speak? Why are we speaking on their behalf? And even if we are speaking on their behalf, we need to do that very, very carefully. We need to be self-reflexive. We should not let our biases come into account, right? While presenting their worldviews, it's very important for us to make way for their voices to be heard. Okay, so she criticizes two Western intellectuals, Foucault and Deleuze, for speaking on behalf of the subaltern rather than creating space for these subjects to speak for themselves. Okay, it is important for us to let them speak for themselves. And she gives one more example because she has also introduced the question of gender. So when British came to India, they outlawed sati practice. So there was also a lot of resistance from the Orthodox Hindu publicists and reformers. Not reformers, but yeah, there were also a few reformers who called themselves reformers, but they were also very adamant that the British government should not interfere with Hindu personal laws. So what happened in this? Oh, it was practice which should have been outlawed. Nevertheless, British also used it as a political tactic. Okay, so how it was portrayed that white men are saving brown women from brown men. This is how the narrative was framed. Okay, but what brown men were trying to say, that this is our culture, XYZ arguments, we are not getting into that. But our central question is that what about the women's agency? The women who are being affected by this particular law or by this particular practice, their voices were not taken into account. Okay, nobody asked what they want. Where is their opinion? Where is their agency? So these categories are not watertight compartments, right? East and West, Orient and Occident. There's a lot of intersectionality that also has to be taken into account whenever we are discussing these issues. And Spivak introduces the question of gender and sexual difference. Okay, she also criticizes Foucault and Deleuze for committing epistemic violence. Okay, what is epistemic violence? First of all, please remember this term because they sometimes ask questions like this: who gave this term epistemic violence? Okay, it is a Eurocentric knowledge to the third world. That is, Eurocentric knowledge is projected on third world countries. So she says that Western academic thinking is produced in order to support their economic interest. So Spivak is also a Marxist post-structuralist critic. So she is also taking into account the economic relationships. She says that the Western academic thinking produces knowledge to support their economic interest. So their economic interest lies in letting the Orients believe that they are inferior to the West. So we also discussed, I think somebody also just answered that why it is a career. It is a career for the Western intellectuals, right? So she is also problematizing this thing. So epistemic violence, when we talk about, we are also talking about how Western frameworks reject Indian knowledge systems or indigenous knowledge systems. Okay, so they are pushed to the periphery. Whatever is central, whatever is important is Eurocentric. This is the perception that is pushed by the colonizers or the Westerners or the Western academics. Okay. And again, we have also discussed this that knowledge is never innocent. It expresses the interest of the producer. And in today's world, we also say that false narrative is one of the biggest weapons. So different kind of narratives are being created. So the narrative which places Europe at the center of everything is also constructed to benefit Europe and or the previous colonizers in an economic manner. Okay. All right. So there's one more term called strategic essentialism. Okay, let's understand this with an example. For example, compare a woman living in a first world country and a white woman with a lot of privileges, wealth, everything. And if you compare her to a laborer in a third world country, a male laborer, okay, can you say that women are underprivileged in this comparison? Can you say that? Anybody? Are you all there?
Yes, ma'am.
So we are comparing two people. Okay, there's this woman living in a first world country, living a privileged life, racially also privileged. She is a white woman, and then we are comparing her to a male person who lives in a third world country and is a laborer. Okay, provides cheap labor. Let's consider that he is also from an oppressed class. Can we say in this context that women are marginalized, women are the subalterns?
Ma'am, we can say that, but at the same time, we cannot. Because, ma'am, if a
Yeah, that's
woman is if the woman is getting all the resources and everything in a first world
hmm.
country and compared to a man who is not getting it, so definitely because the country is different and the thing, whatever the
Hmm.
cultural, the political, everything is different, she is getting it there. But at the same time, here it's different. So we can say it's there, the difference is there and still it's not.
Okay, so what we are trying to say in feminism, we often say that women are underprivileged, right? But this is also an essentialist statement. Essentialism is basically universalizing, homogenizing a category. So if I say women everywhere are underprivileged, but in this case it was not the case, right? So we need to look at the intersectionalities also. There are so many things, there are so many factors that we need to look into. But what happens is she coined the term strategic essentialism. She says that we are essentializing or we are creating categories for the strategic interest. When we say women are underprivileged or women are marginalized, we are saying that in a bigger context. Okay, so in general women are marginalized in various cultures, right? There are cultures that respect women and other scenarios changing everywhere, but strategic essentialism is important to provide certain privileges to work in the best interest of marginalized categories, subaltern categories. Is that clear?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, but I had a doubt. If
Mm-hmm.
we add, matlab, if we put this like strategic essentialism, then we are focusing on the marginalization of certain women in certain places and not generalizing it
Right.
as complete as whole. But ma'am, is it like possible practically? Because if we does that, if we're trying to even focus on the women who are marginalized, we are trying to make it like the whole thing is like the women's are getting an equal position, but there are some women's, but it might lead to that in the impracticality of that it's not possible in certain way, because people will now perceive that women are getting equal rights, and that is the whole thing. It's not that यहाँ पे चाहिए या वहाँ पे चाहिए. People will not understand or perceive it in that way. So it might need to an practicality. Can that happen?
See, I am not able to understand your question. What exactly is your question? So are you trying to say that there will be discrepancies in the opportunity? Who is trying to speak now? Are you trying to say that there will be discrepancies in the opportunities women are getting?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
So yes, that is there. That's what she says. That's the very reason she says strategic essentialism is important. There are certain cases like the hypothetical case I just mentioned. In this, the woman is more privileged, right? But that is not the case with all the women. So the idea behind feminism or any good movement is to create all these movements begin with beautiful ideas, right? To create equality of opportunity, and how resources can be made accessible, and how opportunities can be made accessible for women. So strategic essentialism plays a very important role in that. Whenever we are pushing for more reforms for better opportunities, although there's always the case that somewhere the opportunities are still better than the other places, right? There's no uniformity in different geographical, political, or economic spaces. But when we are pushing for strategic essentialism, we are trying to create an ideal scenario. Okay, so discrepancies will always be there, but we are moving in a direction where we can provide equality of opportunity. That's why strategic essentialism is important, because there are also places where women or any person from a marginalized community has very little rights and they have no agency. So this helps us to push in the direction which is in their best interest. Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
All right, thank you. So let's talk about the case of Bhuvneshwari Bhaduri. Wait a minute. Okay, so Spivak also talks about Bhuvneshwari Bhaduri. Who was Bhuvneshwari Bhaduri? She was one of her relatives, probably her grandmother's sister. And she was given a task of assassinating not a colonized, but a colonizer, some officer from the West. Okay, but she couldn't do it. She couldn't finish the assignment, and to show her regret and to make a statement, she committed suicide. But what are the important points? She committed suicide when she was menstruating. Okay, why this was important for her? Because at that time, whenever a woman used to commit suicide, it was assumed that she had illicit relationship with somebody outside marriage and she was pregnant. So she made this statement that she was not pregnant. Her suicide was not for some love affair. She tried to make this statement that women can do something that is more meaningful. They cannot be restricted. She wanted to do something for her nation. She failed at that. That's why she committed suicide. And one more statement was made that because she was menstruating, she cannot be burned. And it was the practice that women can become sati only if they were quote unquote pure. They were not menstruating. So she made a statement. But what happened when Spivak tried to gather more information about Bhuvneshwari Bhaduri, she found out that none of her relatives were interested in talking about her, and they never talked about her with the pride with which she was expecting them to talk about her. Why? Because she was also a nationalist. She tried to do something. She failed at it. That's a different thing. But she sacrificed her life for a big cause, right? But it was reduced to her female identity, that because she is a woman, she must have had illicit relationship with somebody. That's why she committed suicide. So her identity was also shaped by the discourse around her in the way that she didn't want to. She tried her best to create a statement, but again, she is not remembered the way she wanted to be remembered. Okay? All right. So, a few more terms we'll discuss. One is chutneyfication. You all must have come across this term because I'm pretty sure you have Midnight's Children in your syllabus. And so this term was used by Salman Rushdie in Midnight's Children, and it describes the Indianization of English. That how Indians use English, and throughout the session we have been discussing that both the cultures, the culture of the colonized, the culture of the colonizers, the cultures of the east and the west, they always interact with each other and undergo some form of transformation. So same is the case with the language. Okay, so the way Indians speak English is very different from how an American or a European person will speak English. And this whole style of mixing up comes from chutney. So in India, we have this dish called chutney. So different flavors are mixed together, right? So that is how Indian English is. But just remember for NET that chutneyfication was a term used by Salman Rushdie in Midnight's Children. Okay, now let's talk about diaspora. It comes from a Greek word meaning disperse. So whenever something is dispersed, okay, or spread somewhere, that is referred to as diaspora. But diaspora is a term which is used for people of indigenous origins which are living somewhere else, which are probably living in Western countries. And it denotes a similar range of cultural affiliation connecting groups who have dispersed, migrated beyond national borders. So the NRIs who have been born and brought up in India, or their parents were born and brought up in India, but now they are living abroad. So they are not completely into that culture. They have certain memories of the traditions and the culture, how things used to be done in India. So sometimes they try to recreate it with whatever resources they have. They are the diaspora. Okay. So diasporic communities are tied together by family ties. There are family ties, there are morality. So morality is also socially influenced. So what is considered moral in one culture can be considered immoral in another culture, right? So by the ties of family, morality, manners, the diaspora are the people who, or the diasporic communities are the communities or people who are not living in their nations. They have migrated beyond their national borders, but these are the factors, their traditions and culture, which keep them connected to their nations, their homeland. Okay, such dislocation can create nostalgic and separatist tendencies. There are so many novels, diasporic writers. I will provide you with a list, and I'm not discussing everything in this lecture. I'll give you a list of the important works that you can read later. Okay. Now, whenever we are talking about post-colonialism, we are referring to four worlds. We are saying first world country, second world country, third world country, fourth world nation. What does that mean? So when the Cold War period was going on, first world countries were the countries being referred to as the capitalist Western countries. Okay, so they had capitalistic interest. Capitalism is important, Marxism is important. Why? Because this was the basis on which first world country and second world countries can be distinguished. First world is capitalistic in nature. Okay, these are the Western countries which believe in capitalism, the market forces. But the second world countries, the former Soviet Union, Russia, for instance, so these countries are socialist countries. They believed in the state's control over uh, the resources of production, right? So they propagated socialist ideologies. And when you read Marxism and you also read about Russian formalism, so there was a time when the state believed, the party actually believed that the literature should be of a certain way. Right. So literature should also be socialist. It should show reality and it should promote socialism. Other forms of literature were condemned. They were disbanded. Right, debanned. So socialism and second world country are related. First world countries are the countries which believe in capitalism and are the Western countries. And then when we talk about third world countries, we talk about post-colonial countries, which are erstwhile colony, which used to be a colony. Now they're independent, but they are a signifier of poverty, disease, corruption, nepotism. Again, we need to take all these narratives with a pinch of salt, that why these narratives are created, what are the realities, and if the third worlds are the signifiers of poverty, disease, corruption, is there no poverty, no disease, no corruption in the first world country? Is everyone thriving in the first world country, or poverty is a universal condition? So these are the questions we need to keep in mind, right? Is America poverty free? Is it disease free? Is it corruption free? Is it nepotism free? It is a first world country, right? So all these questions are to be kept in mind. Then we talk about fourth world countries, populations without territories of their own who live within a larger nation, such as ethnic minorities. So so many wars happen, so many wars are still going on. There are communities that are migrating, there are communities that are being displaced, so there are refugees everywhere. So whenever a community, a population leaves their own country and they're living within a larger nation, they are ethnic minorities there. So these people are referred to as fourth world. Now, the very last slide. This could have been an entire presentation in itself, but why I wanted to discuss magic realism here, because it is also a very important form of post-colonial writing. Why post-colonial writing? Because here dreams, supernatural elements, and magic are a part of everyday life of a tribe, community, or an individual. Usually, the people or the protagonists are coming from a third world country, right? A former colony. And this form or this genre originated in South American fiction. And there are certain elements which we need to keep in mind. Everyday life of a colonized or a post-colonial society. Pre-colonial past creeps in, reality itself is breaking down, and there are so many narratives mixed together and oppositional worldviews. The best example that we can discuss is the Midnight's Children. Hana? So what happens in the Midnight's Children? There are the Council of Midnight Children also has children from different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? They have different privileges, different powers, and the narrative mixes together oppositional worldviews. They also have oppositional worldviews, right? Their worldviews are not linear. So there is a polyphony of voices, right? Polyphony, the term used by Mikhail Bakhtin. So there's multiplicity of voices, multiplicity of worldviews, one against the other. So the author is not trying to force one worldview on us. There is a multiplicity of perspectives, which is a very important characteristic of magical realism as a genre. There are several other things that I wanted to discuss, but I guess we don't have time. So I will send you the list of works which are very important and theorists that you must read. I hope this session was helpful in understanding what post-colonialism is, because I tried to keep it more analytical as compared to factual, although factual information is very necessary for your NET exam. But I think if you understand the concept, it will be easier for you to remember. And in case there are any questions, I can answer all those questions as well.
Yes, Sonali. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Maria Ali from BA English Literature first year. First of all, I would like to thank our Department of English for organizing such informative and helpful lectures, which prepares us further for competitions. I would extend a warm thanks to Kriti Acharya ma'am for holding such an informative and detailed lecture on post-colonialism. I also thank you, ma'am, for on the behalf of our department, the whole Eklavya Club, and all the attendees for providing us with great and detailed notes, as these resources are very hard to find. You provide us with every little related information at once and for all. At last, I would like to thank all the committee members for coming together and for organizing and managing such insightful lectures. Once again, thank you and have a great day ahead.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, ma'am.